Well, Rob, you've written about Rodri and his stop-start return from his ACL injury. We saw him for quick as a flash cameo against Bournemouth. Where is he at the moment? And given City are obviously trailing Arsenal in the league, how much pressure is he under to not only come back but come back as the linchpin that makes the whole thing tick for City?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of his recovery, you kind of get the impression that he's quite frustrated, really, because obviously he did his ACL against Arsenal, more than a year ago. He's had an operation. He's kind of gone through that long road to recovery. Spent the first part of it in Madrid, and then he's come back to City, and you start training in the gym, and then you're back on the grass, and then in April he comes and is part of the squad again. Starts his first game at the Club World Cup in June. And then there's this kind of assumption that once you've gone through all that, that you're back and then you're right as rain. And it's not really been like that for him. He's played occasionally this season. He's started games. He started 3 really intense games in a row against Man United, Napoli, and Arsenal. After which Guardiola said, "I'm not really sure whether he's in a position where he can do that week after week." He's then had a hamstring injury. He's missed 4 games. He came back against Bournemouth at the weekend. So, I mean, the piece that's on the site is essentially just about how tough it is for these players to come back, because it's not just those sort of long days and long months spent in the medical room on your own, kind of staring out the window, looking at your mates train. It's actually when you come back and how tough it is in that instance as well, because we're in a period now, and Pep has kind of said it himself a little bit, where Rodri, all of his physical metrics when he's fit might be right there. He's covering the same amount of ground. His sprints are there, the number of sprints, but there's an awful lot that goes on in a player's head in that kind of situation, where he's got to kind of feel comfortable in his own body. He's got to feel comfortable twisting and turning into challenges, that kind of thing. And I was in Monaco watching City a couple of weeks ago, where they drew in the Champions League, and Rodri started that game. In the second half, he gets quite a significant knock in the second half and goes down, and you can see immediately he looks a bit panicked, that his teammates look a bit panicked. In the end, the City sort of physios come on, and he carries on for five or 10 minutes. But you can see in that little 5 or 10 minutes that he's not really himself. It's, I don't know whether his confidence is knocked, or he's a bit worried about having a knock on his knee again. He gets the ball taken off him at one point, and Monaco break quite quickly. And then 5 minutes after that, he's taken off by Pep Guardiola, who brings, I think, Nico Gonzalez on to kind of shore up the midfield. And really the piece that's on the site is essentially around that. And it's difficult for him, and it's difficult for Pep, because he's obviously, like you mentioned there, such a massive part of the team, that they want him back as quickly as possible and in the best form that they can get him in. And it's just not as easy as that. And we're in this little kind of awkward phase now where they're trying to ease him back in, but they also need him desperately.
Do you think part of the problem is the fact that City are obviously having a few collective issues and are in a state of flux themselves? I mean, he's not coming back into a settled side. It's a lot easier for players, when they've been out for a while, to come back into a team that's winning, that knows its patterns of play, that is sort of settled in terms of personnel. It feels as though it's doubly difficult for him because City is still trying to work out exactly what kind of team they are.
Yeah, and that is part of it. And, he had all these kind of rehabilitation last season, where City obviously sort of form-wise fell off a cliff. And every sort of week towards the end of last season, the question to Pep was, when's Rodri coming back? When's Rodri coming back? As if he's like this cure to every problem that they have. And you're right. This season has been better than last season, but it's not been perfect. It's been quite mixed. They've been good in games. They've been poor in other games. And there's still this kind of narrative around City that they need Rodri to play well. And there is, that part of that is true, because he's so important, but there isn't any kind of there's no way of easing him back in, because City need him. It's not, if they were winning sort of every week and they'd won 10 on the bounce, the need for Rodri to be in there wouldn't be as great. And you could say to him, well, maybe take an extra week to get yourself right. Maybe you sit on the bench for 2 or 3 weeks, and we play you, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, then 15 minutes, and we build you back up. Guardiola hasn't really had that luxury. And even though he said repeatedly that they're going to be really, really cautious with him, and they want to make sure that he gets back to his best, and they don't want to rush him, because they know if he breaks down again, that could be, that could have serious consequences for his career. You always feel like right at the end, when he's kind of Rodri's right there. And I'm sure there's an element of Rodri sort of saying, I want to play. And Pep has touched on that a little bit in the past. But you kind of feel that he gets to kind of that level, and Guardiola kind of can't help himself but to chuck him back in, because he just knows that he's so important and he's so integral to what City are trying to do.
I mean, you mentioned sort of Rodri's view on this. I mean, he's obviously one of the players who's spoken out publicly about the fixture scheduling and suggesting that the players could be quite close to striking. And obviously, he's very conscious of that whole kind of workload conversation. I mean, do you sense any hesitancy in him that as he's come over, he's come over obviously a very serious injury, trying to recover from it, that he doesn't want to be rushed himself because he knows what a big year this is with the World Cup at the end of it, and then obviously into the following season where there won't be much of a break because it's an expanded World Cup. Do you feel that he's conscious of that wider debate as much as he is of his own situation?
I imagine he is, because he's a really, really intelligent guy. I mean, we've spoken to him, in press conferences and mix zones. You can tell that he's a kind of very, very switched on to kind of issues outside of his own and outside of his own club. And you say, you're right. He's spoken, probably one of the kind of major voices last year about fixture congestion and what it was doing to players. I think it's quite difficult though for Rodri, because he will understand that his body probably can't get through a 10-month season unscathed with a massive World Cup at the end of it. But also, and it's something that Guardiola has touched on, that I think that footballers inherently just want to play. And so while Rodri will take advice from all City's medical staff and the physios about you need to build up and we can't rush you back too soon, and you might feel great now, but we need to wait till the morning to decide whether you can play at the weekend. And I'm sure that Rodri is the type of player that will take all of that on board and will go away and be really quite considered. I think when Pep Guardiola has got his little tactics board up in the dressing room, that he wants to see his name up there, because he's just desperate to play, particularly after missing so much of last season. So it's a difficult situation for Rodri, because he won't want to push himself, but he also wants to play. It's a difficult situation for Guardiola as well, because he doesn't want to risk the health and the future of one of his best players, if not his most influential player next to Erling Haaland, but also knows that if City want to challenge Arsenal for the title, want to get quite far in the Champions League, as good as Nico Gonzalez is, and Kovacic when he comes in, and Reinders can play there, you just can't replace Rodri. So it's really tough finding that balance, and essentially that is what the piece on the site is all about, finding that balance for these top players and making sure that they can play and be the influence that they've always have been, but also not risking Rodri for the long term, and that as great as players as he is now, that you're kind of risking the next 3, 4, 5 years of his career because you want to get him back right this second.
I mean, you mentioned Arsenal there, and obviously everyone's talking about their squad depth at the moment, and it's sort of interesting, this debate actually, because if you look at even the Burnley game last weekend, there's a definite shift this season in the way that Arteta's managing his players. Gyökeres says he has his best 45 minutes in an Arsenal shirt. He comes off at half time because he's felt something. Martin Zubimendi, one of the signings of the season, stitches the whole thing together. Not unlike Rodri, of course, for City. He feels something. He's taken off at half time. A couple of weeks ago, Bukayo Saka, they're only 1-0 up against Palace. He comes off after an hour because he wasn't able to train in the build-up to the game. He felt a bit of sickness. These sort of decisions that he's made. I think he took Saliba off at half time in that game as well. Again, he felt something. He's coming straight off. And in the past, Arsenal, I think, have been guilty of maybe pushing their players, or their players have wanted to push themselves a little bit too much, because the squad depth hasn't been there and they've needed to take those risks to try and keep pace with City and Liverpool. And it feels a bit this season as though what Arteta and Arsenal are doing now is being a bit cleverer, a bit cuter, and managing that squad better because they feel they've got stronger options. We're talking about an Arsenal team that was obviously clear at the top of the table, and they're missing their captain Martin Odegaard, who up until this season was widely regarded as the guy who stitches all their attacking play together. And of course now they've got Eberechi Eze who can come in, they've got Ethan Nwaneri who can come in those central positions. They can play Mikel Merino in there with Declan Rice and with Zubimendi as a 3. They've got so many different kind of options that I think because they were overusing, particularly Odegaard and Saka in the last couple of years, that were leading to these injuries. You look at, Kai Havertz obviously is out at the moment. I remember sitting in a press conference with Arteta where he described Havertz as a genetic powerhouse about 2 weeks before he got injured and was ruled out for the rest of the season. And what he was trying to do was sort of say, it's all right, these guys can take the load. But I think in the summer, by signing all the players they have, they've looked at it and gone, actually, to compete in 4 competitions. This is no criticism of those individuals. It's just to compete in 4 competitions, we just need more than what we currently have.
Do you think he'll be able to do that and continue to be as cautious the closer Arsenal maybe get towards the end of the season, where that big prize, the Premier League or the Champions League, is in sight, and you've got players like Odegaard, maybe Saka, who are kind of on the verge or just coming back from injuries, because it's one thing being able to do it in October and November, I guess, and another thing having that same caution in March and April when you can really kind of see what's in front of you a little bit.
Well, that will be the temptation, won't it? Is that at the moment they're winning every week. They're still in the 4 competitions. They're in a strong position in Europe, which means he could rotate a little bit more towards the end of the group stage if they've qualified, which I assume they will have with a game or 2 to spare. The FA Cup obviously kicks in January. There are enough games to rotate and keep everyone happy. I think that's an aspect of it as well, is that it's all well and good having this big squad, but if they were to get knocked out of a couple of competitions, you'd start to think, well, there's going to be big players there on not inconsiderable salaries who are getting 10, 20 minutes at best at the end of a Premier League game, and that becomes an issue for them. But it's a problem that they want to have. It's the reason why they've built the squad the way they have. And I think what they'll feel is that in rotating Saka, obviously Odegaard's, that's been enforced because of his injury, but in rotating those players a bit more now, he'll feel as though in March and April he can push them a bit further because there are fewer games in their legs. It's a little bit less of a risk. One other thing that just came to my mind actually was I sat in a briefing last season with a doctor at a Premier League club. It was all a bit impromptu, but they wanted to sort of explain about how the rise of Achilles injuries was explainable through the data. And he talked us through how every Achilles, basically, if you have an Achilles problem or your Achilles flares up at all, you need a minimum of 72 hours for that to calm down before you can train the muscle again. And I thought it was really interesting because obviously 72 hours is 3 days. And at the moment, teams are playing every 3 days. And after this international break, we'll play for every 3 days until March, pretty much. And it just shows you how much the fixture calendar is contributing to a lot of these problems, that if the doctors are saying you need 72 hours before you can train this muscle again, and obviously to train the muscle, you then make the muscle stronger and you make it less susceptible to injury. If all you're doing is maintaining a sort of level of Achilles fitness, if you like, well, you're risking injury as the season goes on because you're not able to train that muscle and build it up and make it more immune to the demands. And I think it's a really good example of how the fixture list is just compounding the problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's a situation with Palace, I think, coming up where they possibly might have to play Sunday, Tuesday. City did it last year. They played a game Sunday, they played a cup tie, I think, on Tuesday. Obviously, lots of the players were changed, but it does feel like we're getting away from that. At least having 3 days between games, and if it seems to be more and more common now that teams are being asked to play Sunday, Tuesday. So instead of actually, fixing the problem, it seems to be getting worse. And you're talking there about 72 hours to rest a muscle. There is a possibility that next season we could see that even reduced even further because there's just so many games to get into such a short space of time.